So welcome to another episode of Constructive Conversations as part of the ResiBuild podcast. Today we're looking at competence, not just as a buzzword, but looking and drilling into what the requirements are now and how it applies to the industry at large, particularly the resi and construction industry. I'm glad to be joined today by Kate Milford, who will introduce herself in a second. But we'll be looking at this conversation to really drill into some of the key requirements which should come out off the back of the Fire Safety Act and the Building Safety Act and all the good work which is being done across multiple different functions and companies. But firstly, Kate, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Thanks. So I am director of a consultancy called Milford Marah, and we specialise, amongst other things, in projects relating to competence development and management. So my business partner and I have worked in lots of different competence projects in lots of different industries over the last 20 years or so. And that ranges from things from kind of in-house approaches to competence management, national and regional policy, things like apprenticeships, qualification development, and international projects as well. So some work out in the Middle East, and I've worked in Europe on the European Taxonomy of Skills, Competencies and Occupations as well. And I'm also a member of the Industry Competence Committee, the BSR statutory committee for competence.
That's interesting. So we'll ask you a few more questions about that a bit later on, but if we can, we're in a very challenging period with lots of transition going on from many aspects, and we've got strong headwinds in the industry. There's lots of different viewpoints on what should and is the right direction, but I'd like to start off just getting a kind of a brief stake in the ground, if you like, on where you feel the sentiment of the industry is generally, and what are the key aspects around competence at the moment.
I think this is a really interesting question because obviously I spend quite a lot of time talking to people working on competence projects, and naturally the people that are engaged with those are interested in it and have identified that there is a need for them to look into it more and that they're accountable for that. So I think we have quite a large population within industry that are taking this seriously, that understands their role and their responsibilities with regards to competence, and they're really keen to work with other groups on kind of consensus arrangements and making sure that they've got the right stuff in place. I think, unfortunately, though, there are messages coming out from kind of wider industry that there is still a large proportion of people that don't understand the legislative requirements, that don't think the requirement for competence is something that relates to them. So I think that spreading awareness, getting that message out, being really clear about what the legislation says, who it applies to, what people need to be looking at is a really key component of what all of us need to be doing moving forward.
Yeah, sure. And do you think that's mainly from a personal, individual understanding, or is that a corporate or organisational level of understanding, or do you think that the two are both part of the same thing?
I think it's a bit of both. In my own personal experience, the larger organisations tend to be more clued up on what they need to be doing, more in touch with the policy agenda.
As an organisation?
As organisations. In some of them that filters down to the individuals quite well, in others maybe not so much. Where we have smaller organisations that are maybe further down the supply chain, I think they can often become more distant from those requirements. And I think sometimes that understanding of what they need to be doing as organisations and individuals is a bit more lost.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if we then kind of cross that over with what we've got from the Building Safety Act, and whilst competence may be deemed as being a fairly new thing which has come off the back of the Building Safety Act and because of the lack of it at Grenfell, if you like, and all those horrendous things which have come out through the inquiry and throughout these other Netflix videos and so on. So tell us about the requirements of where, when you are looking at this and what's come into the limelight, which has perhaps been in law for many years, and also the things which are actually documented in the Building Safety Act. What's your viewpoint from a legal point of view? What is the mandatory requirements? What's your advice on that, or giving us a bit of an understanding as an industry?
The requirement for people to be able to carry out their work has always been there. That's not a new thing. We've seen that explicitly in secondary legislation before. So if you look at the things like the CDM regulations, I think as far back as sort of 2007, 2008, there was an explicit requirement in there around competence for designers, but also for contractors as well. What we've seen with the Building Safety Act is that sentiment from secondary legislation has now been picked up and put into primary legislation. So where it was dotted about, embedded in other things, it's now been put front and centre. And that's what the Building Safety Act has really done. Now, there's a specific section of the Building Safety Act that contains requirements for competence. So Section 35. And that sets out that individuals have to be competent to perform their roles. So they need the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviour. Or where we're not talking about individuals, where that expertise is spread across organisations, that those organisations are capable. So that's kind of what's in the primary legislation. Off the back of that, we know we have lots of other pieces of secondary legislation that link in with that. So things like the building regulations, management of high-risk building regulations, you've still got the CDM regulations, all of those kind of things. And they explicitly set out the mandate for competence as well. So if you look at the building regulations, Regulation 11F, that sets out a general requirement for competence. And again, that says individuals need to have the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviour to be able to perform their tasks under the building regulations. And organisations need to have the organisational capability, which is basically defined as having the right people, processes, resources, all of that kind of stuff in place to make sure they can do what they need to do under the building regulations. So that wording is kind of mirrored across the different pieces of legislation now. And I think it's worth saying that that legislation doesn't just apply in high-risk buildings, it applies across the whole range of buildings as well. So there might be additional requirements for people working on high-risk buildings, but that mandate to have competent people in place and have organisations that are managing those people effectively and putting them in situations where they can work applies across the board.
So we've seen, and I'll unpick some of those. There's lots of excellent gems in that summary there, which we'll dig into in a bit more detail. But firstly, starting with the CDM, obviously, the 2015 revision at least has got principal designer, principal contractor, and so on in there. As you say, the SCEB hasn't accidentally been referred to as skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours again in the Building Safety Act, but there's differences between those, as far as I understand it, between the Building Safety Act principal designer and that. Do you think that's confusing or helpful? Has it been done intentionally? What's your thoughts around that kind of aspect of that?
I don't think it has. I don't think it's really helped people. I think people are starting to get to grips now with the differences between principal designer and principal contractor under the different pieces of legislation, and the requirements for that are being made more explicit. I think it was a source of confusion to start with, but I think people have started to pick through it now, and they're clearer on their responsibilities. And certainly I've heard more people referencing kind of BRPD for building regulations principal designer to make it clear that that's a different accountability from what they've got under CDM regulations as well.
And it's a legal obligation. People can't outsource either, which is something we saw a lot of in 2015, wasn't it? So tell us about a bit more about those responsibilities, the legal obligations of a principal designer and a principal contractor and a client, kind of being the three perhaps most talked about ones.
So within the regulations, there is a requirement for people to be competent to fulfil their own roles. The Building Safety Act and the building regulations don't say how. So it doesn't specify how you have to go about that. There are various things that are going on in industry that I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute that are looking to clarify what those roles are and what you need to demonstrate to become competent in those. There's also a requirement for that to move down the chain as well. So principal designers aren't just responsible for their own competence, they're responsible for anybody that they appoint. And principal contractors, again, not just responsible for their own competence, but that flows down the chain. So if they're appointing subcontractors, they're responsible for appointing suitable subcontractors as well. So it doesn't just put a requirement on those organisations or those people, it puts a requirement on what they're doing when they're bringing other people into the picture.
So putting that into a practical example for people which might not be familiar with this so far, then you've got your client has got obligations which they need to appoint a principal contractor and a principal designer. The designer then has to appoint a competent person, for example, for M&E and for balconies and for various different aspects of things. And then each one of those designers has got their own responsibilities in making sure the work which they're doing and the people which they're working with on that are also competent in that, and that all flows back up into the same piece. Is that how?
Yeah, that's a good explanation.
So give us a bit of an example on that from a contractor's point of view, and how the principal contractor, how that kind of flows down there.
I think it's a similar process. If a contractor is employing subcontractors to do particular parts of the work on their behalf, they need to be able to assure themselves that those organisations have the capability to do that, and that the individuals within them are competent to carry out their work. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to perform checks on every single individual within that organisation, but they have the responsibility. They need to satisfy themselves if they're appointing that subcontractor. So it's a very similar premise.
And whilst this has become a gateway to consideration, because you need to demonstrate to the regulator that you've satisfied yourself that the competence of the people involved in the process are there, this isn't about just fulfilling a kind of tick box exercise, which you're then presenting homework for the building safety regulator to mark, is it? Tell us a bit about the responsibility of individuals in terms of actually proving that they've satisfied themselves, that they're happy with the competence in there, and how's the relationship work with that gateway 2 application, and what the regulators are interested in there.
So I think what that means is that this has to live and breathe throughout the life of everything that's going on. It's not about one single point of compliance where you evidence the regulator that you've got policies and everything's in place, and you tick the boxes and then you get on and do whatever you want. This is about making sure that you're kind of living and breathing what you said you were going to do. So those organisational approaches to managing the competence of people are things that need to persist, not just in the design process, but through the contracting process, the building process. And we know that there's a further handover point at Gateway 3 where that goes into an occupation, and all that information about how buildings were designed, how they were built, who did it, how competent they were, flows through into the rest of the life of the building too. And that information held on to for a long time.
Yes, exactly. And that's the whole kind of purpose of the golden thread being one of the key things which has come off the back of Hackers investigation and recommendations. Also, off the back of that, we've got obviously 2 mandatory regulators, one for the products, the OPSS has taken that role, and the BSR. We've then got groups like the ICSG, ICC. People are probably familiar with the BSR and the OPSS managing that process, and obviously the changes more recently of the MHCLG taking on that from the HSE. But tell us about the role. What is the ICSG, ICC? What is the role of that, and where does it come from?
So the ICC, the Industry Competence Committee, is a statutory committee of BSR. So BSR was required to set up 3 statutory committees as part of its overall remit. It's set out in the Act itself. So the ICC sits alongside the Building Advisory Committee and the Residents Panel as one of 3 statutory committees. Now, the ICC itself was created in recognition of the fact that competence and building competence, extending competence is such a big part of the regulatory change here. So the ICC's role is to provide advice to BSR and to industry on matters of competence as defined in the Act and in the other legislation. So we meet regularly. We're a group of kind of independent professionals that have been appointed based on our skills, knowledge and experience rather than on the organisations that we work for, to look at how we can produce additional guidance and how we can address issues within industry. Now, most of the on-the-ground practical industry collaboration that comes out of ICC doesn't come through the main committee. It comes through working groups that sit underneath it. And a big one of those working groups, probably one of the most major one, is ICSG, so the Industry Competence Steering Group. And their role is to bring industry together to look at creating frameworks for competence in different parts of the built environment, right through from design and specification through to ownership and occupation. So that's about bringing the experts together to look at good practice in each of those areas. So where we've got ICC that's providing high-level guidance, on what good looks like. We've got groups like ICSG that sit underneath that are looking at practically what does that mean in each of the sectors. And I think it's worth saying that this isn't starting from scratch. It's not about saying, now we have a requirement of competence that didn't exist before, we need to reinvent the wheel in the first place. This is about providing additional guidance to industry on how they can discharge their responsibilities, really. So it's about extending the range of tools that's there to support people, rather than kind of creating a new system from scratch.
Yeah. And give us an example of the kind of things which you may have worked on, which is now kind of public people, it's knowledge which people would be aware of there through the work which has been done through those sort of committees.
So the ICC has created some principles for individual competence. They were consulted on with industry and they are available now. They can be accessed through the Industry Competence Committee page on LinkedIn through the consultations that exist there. The BSR is currently looking for a home for them. Hopefully that'll come soon and it'll be easier to point people towards that information. So those principles are designed to kind of hold together all of the individual competence work that's going on at a really high level. Underneath that then we have the ICSG work, which is going across a vast number of different groups looking at the requirements for competence in different places. And those pieces of the puzzle are kind of very much emerging based on when people have got through the conversations that they're having, when industries reach that consensus around their piece of the puzzle, if you like. So there've been some really good frameworks created there in the past. Things like the PAS documents for principal designer and principal contractor that set out competence requirements there. They came out of the ICSG groups or the competence steering group, as was before its new iteration. And they're guiding principles for people performing those particular functions on what competence looks like and how competence can be demonstrated. But it's worth saying there's a lot of other stuff going on as well. So where they were kind of some of the first things that came out, we've got more detailed frameworks in the installation space, for example, looking at various aspects of how that work is completed that are coming out as well. Now, the idea is there's going to be a place for all of that information to go, so it's going to make it easier for people to find. And ICC and ICSG are collaborating on putting together a competence hub that's going to be hosted by the BSI and is likely to be available in January. So if people are looking for more detail on those frameworks, I would say contact ICSG for now. But hopefully in the really short term, we're going to have a place that we can point people towards where all of that information will exist.
Yeah, interesting. So tell us about the overlap with the likes of, I know both of us have been involved in the Joint Competency Initiative, the JCI as it's more commonly known. Where does that overlap with the work which you guys are doing at the ICC?
So again, that is an overlap with the ICSG work that's going on. And JCI has done some really, really good work to look at kind of building facades competence and really break down some of the roles there and look at the infrastructure in place to help deliver competence. The really good thing about ICSG is it's about industry coming together to build consensus. So where groups already exist that have done a really good job of putting people into that picture, it's not about overlapping and kind of fighting for control of that. It's about bringing those groups in. So if we take something like the installer competence program, the CLC have supported that. Fabinet has done a really, really good job of managing that and building that program from the ground up. And she's brought in various other groups that can support with aspects of that work. So, for example, JCI is leading on the envelope piece of that work, making sure that it's bringing its expertise and experience to bear that already sits within the JCI to make sure that we're not creating stuff within ICSG and creating stuff within JCI separately. So the pieces that touch on that are being led by members of JCI.
And so this is where the industry is coming into it from various aspects, from people which represent the glass and glazing through to people which represent specialist fire protection and various aspects, isn't it? So kind of moving on slightly to how does that change with the MHCLG now taking over the BSR? Does that fundamentally change things? Obviously, the HSE have come at it from a safety point of view because that's their background, but does this change anything in is the quick question, I guess.
Not really, no, because the requirements for competence are in legislation, and they are independent of where the BSR and by extension the ICC sit. And they're the governing principles of all the work that's being carried on. So there's nothing in that legislation that's changed right now. So there's nothing that is, there's no changing driver for that programme of work. I think obviously we all know that when things move government departments, there is a change in emphasis sometimes, or a change in priority. But that's something we'll need to manage. I think if the ICC keeps the requirement for competence front and centre, that will govern its work and guide it.
So moving the conversation on to the organisational capacity, one of the things you mentioned in the initial part of our conversation, tell us a little bit about organisational competence. What does that look like, and how does that link with individuals?
Great question. So I mentioned before that the ICC had produced some principles for individual competence, and that a lot of that has flowed through into the ICSG work. The ICC has actually produced some principles for organisational capability as well. They've been out for consultation very recently. They're still out at the moment, although I think that consultation have closed by the time this podcast goes live. And the intent behind those is to really put some guiding principles around what is in the legislation. So where we've seen a lot of focus on the individual competence piece, there's a lot of stuff in the public domain around that. There's been a lot less around organisational capability. So ICC has been seeking to put in place those principles to give people a bit more of something to go on in terms of what they need to do to establish that they're discharging their regulatory responsibilities. Now, they're based around HSE guidance that already existed, called Managing Competence in Safety-Related Systems. So there are 15 key principles in there that kind of go from how you plan for a kind of system for managing competence, to how you implement it, to how you monitor it and check it, and all those kind of things. Because we're talking about the ICC, it's very focused on the management of individual competence, if you like. So how you make sure that people have the right competence, how you deploy them, how you monitor their progress, those kind of things. The ICC and the BSR are going to look at the other aspects of individual, of organisational capability. Sorry, slightly separately from that. Now, at the same time, a Construction Industry Council, a CIC, task and finish group, has set up alongside of that, working with the ICC to look at putting more flesh on the bones. So where ICC have created governing principles, the CIC task and finish group is looking at how they can be implemented. So what does that look like on the ground? And whether, and what proportionality looks like for different sizes of business as well. That guidance is also being consulted on at the moment. Again, I think probably have closed by the time this goes out. But the intention is that gives some really practical examples, case studies, tools that people can use to help their organisations demonstrate organisational capability. I think the really important thing to remember is that it's the responsibility of organisations to make sure that they have the right things in place to do the work that they're doing. So all of these are tools that organisations can use, but it requires thought by those organisations on how to implement those tools and what proportional and reasonable looks like for them. The interface within individual competence is then about saying, this is how we manage competence in our organisation, but this is how we know that individuals that work within it are competent. So that individual competence is kind of a piece of the bigger puzzle, if you like. And then it's about saying, what are the frameworks that are available? How do we know? What does industry best practice look like in this place? I think it's important to remember, though, as I was saying, that responsibility and accountability does rest with those organisations. So it's really worth putting some thought into what your organisational approach is. How do you know? How would you justify that if something did happen?
Yeah, so some really good points made there. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of other sort of smaller aspects of the same part there. So the first thing I wanted to ask about was proof of competence. Sometimes, and we've been involved in roughly 4 Gateway 2 applications now, and we're also part of the Gateway 3 application, which was the first new build to be approved. But during that process, we've had some very thorough question sets and understanding about our organisational capabilities, the individual designers and so on as well of that. But we've also had some very tick box like are you qualified as this? Are you qualified as that? Interested firstly on your view of that kind of approach. Is tick box an anticipated approach, or is that certainly kind of really part of the sort of historic way of using it? What's your thoughts around that? And then the second part of the question was kind of qualifications more generally. What's the role of those? We've obviously there's a lot of knowledgeable people which have gained knowledge, experience has come from what they originally learned in their qualification, but we've also seen in the Grenfell inquiry qualified architects, qualified fire engineers and so on being heavily scrutinised for poor competence. So what's your thoughts on those sort of two aspects?
I think we can't have a tick box approach. Every organisation is different. In a lot of cases, individuals within organisations with the same job title have different job roles. So I think as organisations, they need to be really clear about what people are actually doing and what the scope of their work is. If we look back at the legislation, it's very clear that we're not just talking about skills and knowledge, we're talking about skills, knowledge, experience and behaviour. Now, some of those things we can measure quite easily through qualifications, particularly the skills and knowledge part of it. But it's still a snapshot of a moment in time. It tested what your skills and knowledge were at that time to a greater or lesser degree. And some qualifications do that really well. Other qualifications are not so linked to what happens on the ground within industry. So I think qualifications have their place. But I don't think we can rely solely on qualifications to evidence competence, particularly because the experience and behaviour elements of competence are often less to the forefront of those qualifications, should I say, particularly where those qualifications are not kind of actively site-based and assessed at site. We also need to remember that the requirement for competence isn't about kind of a tick and you're done. I demonstrated competence once, I never need to demonstrate it again. A key principle of what came out of the review of the building regulations and of Judith Hackett's work was about making it a live thing. So it's not just about what you could do at the time you got your degree or the time you got your professional qualification. It's about how you've continued to keep that up to date. So things like CPD, yes, to learn about new products or systems, or to keep up to date, manufacturers CPD and things like that for installers to make sure the installation knowledge is really there, but also that evidence of ongoing experience and evidence of behaviour as well. So if we think about designers particularly, the experience of working on different projects, different sizes, different environments is really essential to be able to prove competence. And there's a theme that runs through everything, which is around understanding the limits of competence as well. So although that can come across in a qualification, you can talk about how you would do that. It's something that evolves in practice. So being able to look critically at your work and say, that's something that I think I'm capable of doing based on my previous experience, based on what I've done to date. Or that's something that I'm not capable of doing in my own right, but I might be capable of doing with support. And again, within organisations, looking critically at the people that are working for them. What the legislation doesn't say is if you've never done it before, you can't do it now, because we'd never get anywhere. What it says, if you're not competent to do something, you have to be supervised. So there's still a space to build experience and build capability as we go along. But I think it's that piece around looking critically about what you can do and what you can't do, and keeping this as a living, breathing system.
Absolutely. So it might be that somebody's transitioned. It might be they're transitioned in from from perhaps straight from education, completed sixth form, built up their knowledge on the job, if you like, and their experience over a 10-year period, and have continued doing a sort of a CPD process throughout their role. Might be much more up to date than somebody who's done a qualification originally and actually not kept up the CPD, because the market changes a lot, doesn't it? Especially if we look back at how buildings were built 10 years ago versus now, it has fundamentally changed in many respects. It's interesting, the emphasis on it, and there's obviously lots of emphasis on hours of CPD. Is that from, for example, that white paper which was released from the JCI about the envelope sector and suggested hours of CPD based on roles and so on. is that why the emphasis is there, do you think, on various different people which approach it to make sure that we keeping up to date is more important than what original benchmark was?
I think both are important, depending on kind of the stage of your career that you're at. I mean, you put it very well. If your early career, what you've learned in your qualifications, and I don't mean early career as in young necessarily, I mean maybe new into an industry or a role, they're very important to give you the foundations. But like you said, that professional practice develops, knowledge changes over time, requirements change over time, and it's really important to keep up to date with that. I think the concept of a number of hours of CPD is a really interesting one, and I think it works better in some places than in others.
Yep.
I think in roles that are very driven, very self-driven, where we're talking a lot about professional practice and developing your own professional expertise, like in the case of a lot of designers, where there's a lot of emphasis on you to keep up to date with what's going on, you to develop your practice in your own right, almost independent of the organisation that you're working for, because this is about your career and your professional capability. Then a number of hours of CPD with a relatively low amount of guidance works really well. I think if we look at installer roles, for example, mandating a specific number of hours of CPD, probably it isn't necessarily as fit for purpose.
Yeah.
So CPD is a good thing. That ongoing training needs to happen. That ongoing evidence of experience and behaviour needs to happen. But in terms of saying it's this number and this is what you've got to do, I think potentially what that leads to is an over-reliance on completing the same training over and over again just to demonstrate that you've completed a specific number of hours. I think in the case of installers, it's more about looking at the time spent on the job and the work that they've been exposed to during that time. So, for example, if you qualified as a I don't want to pick one specifically.
A balcony installer.
That would be a good. So, for example, if you qualified as a balcony installer, and then you didn't work for the next 10 years, you've not kept your skills and knowledge up to date. But if you have continued to work in that time, if you've continued to apply the skills and knowledge that you have in the workplace, then that will be fresh. It won't have drifted off as much over that period of time. So I think it's about horses for courses, really, but making sure that those elements of continuing practice, continuing demonstration of competence, and in some cases, extension of that competence and moving up within different roles in organisations is really important.
That might be much more important, whereas if, as you say, the installer process, if they're doing the same thing day in, day out, it might be more about assessing the behaviours on there, but that needs to be on a product and organisational kind of assessment. The behaviours of is a key question on this, and this is something which I know has been a criticism of some of the card schemes and so on, or things more generally, is it might not be assessing behavioural pieces and so on. I'd be interested on your thoughts on that. Obviously, traceability brings accountability. That's something which certainly we've introduced that in our quality app, so that you can see where there's gaps in knowledge and you can address that. Or you can see where there's behavioural things which can be addressed, but you've also got that golden thread of information which brings accountability with it. What's your thought around behavioural assessment, the interface with traceability and so on? Tell us a little bit about that from your experience.
So for me, the behaviours is really where the individual competence and organisational capability overlap. So although we can have elements of assessment of behaviours and within kind of third-party schemes or within qualifications or those kind of things, really we know on the ground the majority of behavioural assessment, and I mean that in its broadest term, the majority of checking on whether people are behaving appropriately happens within organisations. When you have somebody third-party come in to observe that, people are going to behave well, because they're being monitored and they're being observed. So I think a lot of that behavioural evidence and kind of evidence of whether people are behaving consistently with what's been set out in terms of the competence requirements has to come via organisations. It has to be built into their management processes. It has to be built into their appraisal processes and whatever else they're using as organisations to check on really whether they should be continuing to work with those people. So I think that's the first thing. I think sometimes what people are looking for is a silver bullet for a tick in the box they can give that the behaviours are there. My advice would be to think of it less like that and think more about how you integrate appropriate behaviours into those kind of organisational mechanisms. By extension, I think those behaviours flow down from organisational culture as well. So it's about making sure we have the right organisational culture. And I mentioned principles for organisational management of competence. Part of that work has been to set out what good organisational culture looks like. So organisations have a target to aim at. In terms of traceability and accountability of work and the golden thread, I think it's great that we have all of that information. It's definitely needed in terms of what happens going forward and making sure the information about buildings and their safety and how they were built is there. I think we need to be a little bit careful that doesn't become a tool to beat people with at the coalface. I think we need to make sure that we're using all of that information that we have to look at systemic changes if problems are identified, rather than to pin it on individual bad behaviour. The question that I would be asking is how did that situation occur? What put that individual in that situation if there is a failure? Rather than looking for an individual to blame to make the problem go away.
But I think partly this is the kind of purpose of the golden thread as well, isn't it? That you've got that seamless in this golden thread of information about a building. Yes, but manufacturers should be looking at that throughout their process as well, because you want to be capturing. Obviously, it's a requirement, a legal requirement, to have a golden thread in a digital format, and part of the purpose of that is that you can trace it back and you can see where patterns of behaviours have been. You can see what decisions have been captured on things, and the reporting of those as well to the BSR is obviously part of that. But I guess the workmanship, images of the workmanship on a regular basis probably gives, as you say, a better assessment of behavioural competence and what has happened over a period of time, versus sending, as you say, an assessor. It's like when you put a policeman on a motorway, guess what? Everyone drives at the speed limit. Take him off at the next junction and it probably changes. And that is something which we're all conscious of, but I'm conscious we're sort of coming to a close now. I'd be interested, and Kate, in what's your key takeaway for people who are watching this, working maybe in a variety of different roles, but what's your key takeaway of kind of competence, and how should that, what should you be thinking about if you've been if you're looking for something on competence?
I think for me, it's about understanding that competence is the responsibility of everyone. That sounds really cheesy, but we all within this industry have a requirement to be competent. That's not just legislative, I think, because it's the right thing to do as well. In order to figure out whether we're doing that, we need to look critically at what we're actually doing. So if we're a manufacturer producing products, what are we actually doing? Are we just manufacturing, or is that manufacture, design, specification, sales? Really think critically about what functions are being performed, and then look at how you become competent in those things, because that's how you build up this system and make sure the activities that people are completing, they're actually competent to complete.
So just a last point, if I may, on that, is that people may have been aware of the requirements, the legal obligations which flow down, as we talked about, through the principal contractors, principal designers, but may not be expecting you to have included words like sales in there. Tell us a little bit more about kind of where that fits in with the bigger picture.
So in terms of the Industry Competence Steering Group, there's work going on right across the supply chain. Some of that is more well developed than other pieces, and some of it is newly emerging. But there will be groups in future, or that are starting to coalesce right now, that are looking at things like sale and distribution, at kind of product management, those kind of things. And I would urge people, if they have a real interest in that and defining competence for that, to definitely approach ICSG to look at it. I think what we're talking about is the whole system. They talk about buildings as systems when they talk about the legislation. You think of competence as a system as well. It's not just about the installation piece. It's not just about the design piece. It's about how the products even got there in the first place, the information that designers were using when they were designing those products in, the information that they're being supplied with if somebody buys something off the shelf for a particular purpose. So it's one big system. And I think the things you wouldn't normally think about, like distribution or like sales, form an important part of that. Because without that information being right, without those people being competent to give the right information, with feeding kind of errors into other parts of the system as well. So for example, if you take passive fire specifically, they've created a framework that goes right across the piece from design and specification to ownership and occupation. Two of the really important focuses for them were around design and specification. So that's technical design and spatial coordination really, rather than concept design, but also in sales and distribution as well, because it's really important that the people that are selling passive fire products into the market are giving information correctly, that they are aware of the limits of their capability and their competence, and aware of where they need to be pointing people back to manufacturers, because that's a design consideration rather than a sales consideration.
So that's really interesting, and I think that's a really good point to conclude on, is that what we're really looking at is any area which can influence the outcome of projects, right from the R&D to the sales, the marketing, the design, the contractors, the installers, everyone involved in that process should be thinking about where their competency starts, whether they're competent, and where the limits of their competency is as well. But thank you, Kate, for coming today. I think my key point and takeaway from this really is it's not just about those who are working at the forefront of contracting or designing on an HRB. This is a wide obligation which we have, not necessarily a new obligation, but it's a wide piece throughout the whole industry. So again, thank you very much for your insights. It's been really insightful, and thank you for joining us. And for the audience, thank you very much for joining us on this exciting podcast. Do subscribe to our podcast to see the next topical ones. But again, competence, a key area in a very challenging time in the industry at the moment. Watch this space for more about the whole interpretation of the key fundamental themes in the marketplace. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye from us.